The moment he realizes you're never going to call again is the exact moment your life quietly shifts from dependence to authority, from waiting to deciding, from holding on to rising up. Most people think this moment is about him, about his regret, his reaction, his confusion. But the truth is far deeper. This moment is about you reclaiming the energy you once scattered, the peace you once surrendered, and the identity you once diluted just to keep someone who didn't know how to value you. When he finally understands that your number will never light up his phone again, that your voice is no longer available to soothe his ego, that your presence is no longer guaranteed no matter how many times he walks away and returns, something powerful happens inside you that cannot be reversed. You begin to understand that you were never powerless, only emotionally invested. You were never weak, only hopeful. You were never desperate, only loyal to the wrong person. This awakening begins quietly. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, and it's not something you announce. It happens in the stillness of your mind. It happens after the long nights when you cried yourself to sleep and realized that no message from him ever healed you. It happens when you finally see that you spent more time trying to prove you were worthy of his love than realizing he was never worthy of the version of you who kept forgiving him. The moment he realizes you're gone is the same moment you realize you are enough. You don't need validation from someone who failed to recognize your value the first time. You don't need to chase someone who kept running because they were not prepared to receive the depth of your heart. This is the turning point where you begin to detach, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself. You stop arguing for your importance. You stop begging for clarity. You stop making excuses for his behavior. You stop rewriting your boundaries just to keep him comfortable. Instead, you stand still, you breathe, and you reclaim the emotional strength you gave away piece by piece. This is the beginning of your emotional independence. And independence doesn't always roar, it often whispers. It whispers through the decision not to call. It whispers through the strength of not reacting. It whispers through the discipline of holding your silence. And those whispers become a powerful internal voice that redirects your life. This moment transforms everything because it breaks a cycle that once controlled your emotions. When you stop calling, you stop participating in the emotional loop that kept you stuck. You detach from the expectation that he will change. You detach from the fantasy of what he could be. You detach from the fear of losing him because you finally recognize you were losing yourself in the process. And once you choose yourself, your whole world begins to rearrange. Your energy begins to return. Your peace begins to return. Your self-respect begins to rise from the places you buried it. You no longer look at your phone waiting for something that may never come because you have accepted that your future is bigger than the temporary comfort of his presence. This turning point is also spiritual because it teaches you to trust yourself again. For so long, you doubted your intuition because your heart wanted one thing while reality showed you something else. Now you understand that your intuition was never wrong. You were simply avoiding the truth because the truth required change, and change required courage. But once you stop calling, once you step back, once you release the attachment, courage becomes natural. You begin to operate from a place of inner certainty rather than emotional desperation. You begin to see that the love you were searching for from him is the love you were supposed to rebuild within yourself. When he realizes you're not coming back, you realize you don't need to. You realize that the peace you feel in your silence is more valuable than the chaos you felt in his presence. You realize that your energy blossoms without his inconsistency. You realize that your mind becomes clearer without the emotional confusion he brought into your life. This moment shifts you from a person who was trying to be chosen into a person who chooses themselves. It shifts you from waiting for someone else to decide your worth into someone who defines it with boundaries, clarity, and self-respect. This turning point is powerful because it marks the beginning of your return to yourself. It's the moment where you stop fighting for a relationship and start fighting for your healing. It's where you stop searching for closure and start creating it. It's where you stop hoping for change and start becoming the change. It's not the end of your story, it's the rebirth of your identity, your confidence, and your emotional freedom. Silence becomes your power when you finally understand that not everything deserves your reaction, not every emotion deserves to be expressed, and not every person deserves access to your heart. For so long, you believed that communicating, explaining, and expressing your pain would somehow make someone treat you better, respect you more, or finally understand your worth. But silence teaches a different truth. Silence shows you that clarity doesn't come from repeating yourself. It comes from stepping back and observing what someone chooses to do when you no longer guide them, remind them, or beg them to act right. Silence is not about punishing him, it's about liberating you. It's about creating enough emotional distance for you to see the relationship for what it truly was, not what you hoped it could be. Silence creates a pause in your life where your thoughts can breathe, where your heart can heal, and where your intuition can speak without being drowned by emotional noise. Your silence is sacred because it allows you to reclaim your personal power. Every time you choose not to respond out of impulse, you strengthen your emotional discipline. Every time you resist the urge to reach out, you build resilience. And every time you sit with your emotions instead of trying to escape them, you grow in ways that communication could never achieve. Silence becomes a mirror that reflects everything you overlooked while you were trying too hard to keep the relationship alive. You start to see the patterns that drained you, the moments you settled, the times you ignored your boundaries, and the ways you allowed your self-worth to hinge on someone who didn't value you. Silence opens your eyes to reality because in stillness, the truth becomes undeniable. And once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. In silence, you step out of the emotional storm and into a space where you can finally breathe without fear, without pressure, and without trying to prove anything. You begin to rediscover who you are when you're not constantly trying to fix someone else. You reconnect with the parts of yourself you dimmed to keep the relationship smooth. You remember dreams, desires, and potentials that you suppressed because you were too focused on him. Silence realigns you with your soul's voice, the voice that gently reminds you that you deserve peace, joy, stability, and love that doesn't confuse you. Silence becomes the environment where healing takes root. It is where emotional wounds begin to close, not because time passes, but because you finally stop reopening them with repeated conversations that always led nowhere. Silence also creates a powerful shift in how he sees you. When you no longer respond, no longer chase, no longer attempt to save the connection, he is forced to confront the absence of your energy. He begins to feel the weight of your silence, the space left behind where your emotional labor once existed, the vacuum created by your absence. Silence makes him face the reality that he took your presence for granted. But the deeper truth is that the purpose of your silence is not to make him regret losing you, it's to help you stop losing yourself. Silence is the boundary that protects you from returning to the same cycle that hurt you, the cycle where you gave more than you received, where you explained more than he listened, where you fought for someone who didn't fight for you. Silence is not avoidance, it is alignment. It is choosing your emotional health over temporary comfort. It is choosing reflection over reaction. It is choosing growth over repetition. When you embrace silence, you shift from seeking external validation to building internal strength. You stop needing answers that won't change anything. You stop needing closure from someone who didn't honor your heart. You stop giving attention to someone who didn't know how to handle it. Instead, you turn inward. You nurture yourself. You rebuild your identity. You strengthen your boundaries. And through that process, you begin to rise. Silence becomes your foundation for transformation because it teaches you patience, control, and awareness. It slows everything down enough for you to understand your emotional triggers, your fears, and your patterns. Silence becomes your protection. It guards your energy from people who drain it. It shields your heart from conversations that would reopen old wounds. It keeps you from slipping back into habits that no longer serve you. And as you protect your peace, you start to value it more. You become selective about who gets access to you. You become intentional with your time, your conversations, and your emotional investments. Silence becomes a filter that separates what is good for your soul from what is harmful to it. And slowly, without forcing anything, you begin to feel yourself returning to your center. You begin to feel stronger, calmer, more confident, and more connected to your inner power. Silence becomes the quiet revolution inside you that transforms the pain of the breakup into wisdom, self-respect, and emotional mastery. Emotional detachment is not something that happens in a single moment, nor is it a sudden switch that turns off your feelings. It is a process, a journey, a skill that you build through repeated decisions to choose clarity over confusion, self-respect over longing, and peace over attachment. In the beginning, detachment feels uncomfortable because you're breaking habits created by emotional dependence. You were used to checking your phone, waiting for his messages, replaying old conversations, questioning what you did wrong, and overthinking every small detail. These patterns become ingrained in your mind because they were tied to emotional hope. The hope that he might change, the hope that he might return, the hope that love would suddenly become what you imagined. When you begin to detach, you're not just letting go of a person, you're letting go of the version of yourself who was holding on. Detachment starts with awareness. You begin to notice how much emotional energy you've invested in someone who didn't show up for you. You start recognizing how often you sacrificed your peace just to maintain the illusion of connection. You realize how much power you handed over to someone else to determine how you feel about yourself. And this awareness becomes the fuel for your transformation. Because once you see the truth of your behavior, you cannot continue living in emotional autopilot. You begin to pull back, not because you no longer care, but because you realize that caring without boundaries destroys you from the inside. You stop reaching out impulsively. You stop chasing answers that bring more confusion. You stop trying to force clarity from someone who avoids responsibility. This quiet withdrawal is the first step toward emotional detachment. Detachment becomes stronger when you accept reality for what it is, not what you wish it to be. This acceptance is painful because it forces you to confront the gap between your expectations and his actions. You recognize that the future you imagined with him was built more on your effort than his commitment. You see that the love you wanted from him was never something he was prepared or willing to give. Acceptance breaks the fantasy, and although it hurts, it also frees you. It frees you from waiting for change. It frees you from holding on to potential. It frees you from believing that if you just tried harder, he would finally understand your value. Acceptance is a turning point where your energy begins to return to you, piece by piece. As you detach, you learn to redirect your focus. Instead of obsessing over him, you begin focusing on yourself, your healing, your boundaries, your habits, your emotional strength. You start to pour energy into activities, goals, and routines that make you feel grounded. You stop checking his online status, stop evaluating your worth based on his silence, stop searching for signs that he might come back. Redirecting your energy stabilizes your emotions because you're no longer feeding the attachment. Every moment you invest in yourself becomes a step away from him and a step closer to your emotional freedom. You begin to feel your confidence rising again. You start to reconnect with parts of yourself you neglected while trying to keep the relationship alive. Detachment also involves mastering your emotional triggers. Every memory, song, message notification, or familiar routine may try to pull you back into the cycle. But instead of reacting, you begin to observe your emotions. You let the feelings come without letting them control your behavior. You learn to sit with discomfort without chasing relief through contact. You learn to differentiate between missing someone and needing someone. You learn that urges pass, emotions shift, and thoughts lose their power when you don't act on them. This emotional discipline strengthens your detachment because it teaches your mind that you no longer respond to old patterns. Another part of building detachment is rewriting your internal narrative. For so long, you told yourself stories that kept you stuck, stories that convinced you he was the only one who could make you feel loved, stories that made you believe you weren't enough. Stories that made you accept less because you feared losing him. As you detach, you begin to replace these stories with truth. You remind yourself that love isn't supposed to feel like emotional imbalance. You remind yourself that someone who values you will never force you to question your worth. You remind yourself that losing someone who couldn't appreciate you isn't a loss, it's liberation. This new internal narrative becomes a foundation for emotional strength. Detachment becomes a lifestyle when you stop giving power to his absence. Instead of longing for him, you begin to see the space he left as an opportunity for growth. Instead of feeling rejected, you begin to understand that you outgrew the emotional version of yourself that tolerated inconsistency. Instead of trying to win him back, you focus on winning yourself back. You rediscover your voice, your confidence, your goals, your inner peace. Emotional detachment becomes a skill you practice daily by choosing silence over impulsive reactions, boundaries over emotional chaos, and self-love over the desire to be validated by someone else. And slowly, without forcing anything, you begin to detach, not because you want to, but because you have become someone who no longer needs to hold on. The pain you're feeling right now is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something inside you is being rebuilt through discomfort. Pain after a breakup often feels like a collapse, like a part of you has been stripped away, leaving you empty, confused, and overwhelmed. But emotional pain is not a prison meant to trap you. It is a teacher meant to shape you. It's teaching you what your heart truly values, what your boundaries should be, what you have ignored for too long, and what you deserve moving forward. Pain is the alarm system of the soul, signaling that you can no longer carry the same patterns, habits, and emotional wounds into the next chapter of your life. It pushes you to confront the truth you avoided while you were attached, that you were giving more of yourself than you were receiving, that you stayed hopeful when the relationship lacked clarity, that you accepted behavior that did not honor your worth. Pain becomes a teacher the moment you stop resisting it. When you stop trying to numb it, silence it, or escape from it through distractions, denial, or emotional bargaining, you begin to understand what the pain is trying to reveal. Pain forces you into stillness. In that stillness, you hear the truth you avoided. You begin noticing all the subtle ways you abandoned yourself, trying to hold the relationship together. You see the patterns that kept repeating, patterns you dismissed because you were afraid of losing him. Pain makes you confront your loneliness, your fears, your insecurities, but not to punish you, to free you from depending on someone else to fill those emotional gaps. Pain breaks the illusions you built around the relationship and forces you to look at who he really was, not who you hoped he could become. The pain of letting go shapes your identity because it forces you to rebuild on a stronger foundation. When everything feels like it's falling apart, that is actually the beginning of your reconstruction. You start learning what love should feel like, not confusion, not imbalance, not emotional highs followed by emptiness. The pain shows you where your boundaries were unclear, where your self-worth was fragile, where your voice went silent. Through that realization, a stronger version of you begins to emerge. A version that won't settle for half-effort gestures. A version that won't tolerate inconsistency disguised as affection. A version that understands emotional stability is not a privilege, it's a requirement. Pain also activates parts of your strength you didn't know existed. You discover resilience in the nights you thought you wouldn't survive. You discover clarity in the silence you once feared. You discover independence in the moments you expected to fall apart, but instead learn to stand taller. Pain reshapes you by stripping away the emotional illusions you use for comfort and replacing them with wisdom. It teaches you to trust yourself again. It teaches you to rely on your own emotional grounding instead of someone else's attention. It teaches you that healing doesn't come from the one who hurt you, but from the one who chooses to rise after the hurt you. This pain is also refining your emotional intelligence. You learn to differentiate real love from attachment, intention from inconsistency, effort from words. You become more aware of what genuine connection feels like, what emotional safety means, and what red flags look like. Pain sharpens your intuition. You begin to see that the moments that hurt the most weren't signs of love, they were signs of what needed to end. Pain steers you away from repeating the same emotional cycles in the future because it imprints lessons deep within your soul. These lessons guide you toward healthier relationships, stronger boundaries, and a more stable sense of self. The pain you feel is the pressure required to remove the old emotional layers that no longer serve you. It removes the version of you who accepted apologies without change. It removes the version of you who feared being alone more than being unhappy. It removes the version of you who stayed loyal to potential instead of reality. Each wave of pain dissolves another layer of the emotional dependency that kept you tied to someone who wasn't aligned with your growth. Even when it hurts, you are shedding parts of yourself that were built on insecurity, fear, and longing. And underneath those layers is the real you, the grounded, confident, emotionally stable version who has always been there, waiting for this transformation. Pain also teaches you emotional discipline. When you're hurting, your mind tries to pull you back into old habits, to call him, to check on him, to reconnect with the familiar, even if it's harmful. But every time you choose not to go back, even in pain, you strengthen your inner resolve. Pain teaches you how to sit with your emotions instead of running from them. It teaches you patience, endurance, and emotional maturity. You learn that healing is not linear, that some days you feel strong, and some days you feel shattered, and both are part of the journey. You learn to accept your emotions without letting them control your actions. This emotional discipline becomes one of the greatest strengths you will take into your future. Pain is guiding you toward your new identity, even when it feels unbearable. It's carving out space for clarity, peace, and self-respect. It's preparing you for a future where you no longer have to question your worth, where love feels stable and safe, where you don't have to beg for consistency or shrink yourself to keep someone close. Pain is shaping you into someone who rises not because they avoided suffering, but because they learned to grow through it. When he finally realizes that you're truly done, that you're no longer available to answer his messages, soothe his insecurities, fix his mistakes, or carry the emotional load of the relationship, he is forced to confront something he's been avoiding for a long time, himself. Your silence becomes the mirror he cannot escape. It reflects back every choice he made when he thought you would always be there, no matter what he did. It reflects the moments he dismissed your feelings, the times he took your presence for granted, the times he walked away believing you would chase him, the times he chose his ego over the connection you were fighting to protect. When you stop calling, when you stop reaching out, when you stop trying to make him see the value of what he had, he is no longer able to hide behind excuses or distractions. The weight of your absence becomes a lesson he never expected to face. But while he is confronting his reflection, something even more powerful is happening within you. You begin to rise in ways he never anticipated. You no longer seek validation from his attention or clarity from his words. Instead, you begin to reclaim your emotional independence. You begin to see your value not through his treatment, but through your own growth, healing, and awareness. When he realizes you're done, you begin to realize you were giving your love to someone who wasn't ready to receive it. You realize that the emotional labor you poured into him was never matched. You realize that the version of love you offered required maturity, effort, and reciprocity, qualities he didn't consistently show. Your decision not to call becomes the beginning of your emotional freedom, and emotional freedom has a way of changing everything. His realization is often delayed because he was comfortable. He believed your heart was his safety net. He assumed your forgiveness was endless. He treated your loyalty like it was guaranteed. But when that comfort disappears, when the messages stop, when the energy is pulled back, when the emotional supply he relied on is no longer available, the shock forces him to look at himself honestly. He begins to feel the consequences of complacency. He begins to question why you suddenly changed. He begins to wonder who you are becoming without him. But that's the beauty of your growth. You don't owe him explanations for a transformation that pain pushed you into. Your absence becomes a form of truth. It shows him what your presence truly meant. It reveals the emotional stability you brought into his life, the support he overlooked, the patience he took advantage of. But your growth is not about making him regret anything. It's about you stepping into a version of yourself that refuses to be taken for granted again. When he realizes you're done, he is faced with a silence that forces him to acknowledge the gap between how he acted and what he lost. But while he is confronting that gap, you are learning how to fill the gaps in your own heart with self-respect, discipline, and clarity. This moment becomes powerful because it reverses the emotional dynamic you once lived in. When you were invested, he was distant. When you cared deeply, he was inconsistent. When you tried to fix things, he took his time giving you answers. But now, roles shift not out of manipulation, but out of growth. The version of you he knew was emotionally available, forgiving, understanding, and accommodating. The version of you he sees now is grounded, silent, emotionally in control, and no longer willing to shrink yourself to fit the relationship. Your transformation forces him to see what he never saw when he had full access to you. This is where he begins to question himself. He starts to wonder why you're no longer trying, why you're no longer reaching out, why the emotional warmth he depended on has turned into cold silence. And while he questions, you continue rising. You work on your healing. You invest in your goals. You deepen your self-worth. You rebuild your peace. He looks backward, but you move forward. He searches for the old version of you, but she no longer exists. He misses who you were, but you're becoming someone stronger. Your absence teaches him what your presence once covered. Without your reassurance, he feels insecure. Without your patience, he feels lost. Without your emotional support, he realizes how much of his stability came from you. And this is not meant to inflate your ego, it is meant to reveal the truth. Your energy was powerful, your presence was meaningful, and your love had value. But the most important part of this moment is understanding that his realization is not your responsibility. It is not your job to manage his regret, comfort his confusion, or guide him through his awakening. His reflection is his journey. Your growth is yours. He learns through your absence, but you grow through letting go. He confronts himself, but you rediscover yourself. He misses you, but you become someone emotionally whole. And while he is processing the consequences of losing you, you continue stepping into the future. You deserve one built on self-respect, emotional clarity, and the kind of love you will never have to beg for again. Healing begins not when the pain disappears, but when you stop feeding the thoughts that keep that pain alive. You heal by redirecting your energy instead of reacting to every emotional trigger that surfaces. For so long, your emotions were tied to him, his messages, his silence, his actions, his absence. Every move he made shaped your mood, your day, and sometimes even your sense of worth. But healing requires you to take that power back. It asks you to stop giving emotional control to someone who is no longer part of your life. Redirecting is the moment you say, I no longer give my energy to what drains me. It's a subtle shift at first, almost invisible, but it becomes the turning point of your emotional transformation. When you redirect, you stop chasing closure from someone who didn't offer clarity while he had you. You stop replaying memories, trying to understand what went wrong. You stop looking for explanations that won't change anything. Instead of reacting to your feelings, texting in weakness, checking in out of habit, or seeking comfort from the familiar, you choose to sit with the discomfort long enough to understand it. This is how emotional mastery is built. Not by suppressing emotions, but by understanding them deeply enough that they no longer control your behavior. Redirecting means choosing your future over your past. It means refusing to let temporary urges pull you back into cycles that hurt you. Healing by redirecting means using your energy for growth rather than grief. Instead of pouring emotional strength into someone who didn't hold your heart with care, you begin investing in the parts of yourself that you neglected while you were attached. You return your attention to your goals, the dreams you paused, the routines you abandoned, and the inner stability you sacrificed while trying to keep the relationship alive. You stop giving energy to what if and start giving energy to what now. You learn that every moment you redirect toward yourself is a moment of healing, even if it doesn't feel like progress immediately. Healing rarely looks dramatic. It looks like small decisions repeated daily. Decisions like choosing not to check his social media, choosing not to respond to emotional impulses, choosing a walk instead of a memory, choosing self-respect over longing. Redirecting also means reclaiming your mental space. Breakups often leave your mind cluttered with questions, doubts, regrets, and what ifs. These thoughts cycle endlessly because your mind is trying to make sense of something that emotionally overwhelmed you. But the more you react to these thoughts, the stronger they grow. Redirecting doesn't mean pretending the thoughts don't exist. It means refusing to entertain them. When the memories come, you acknowledge them without diving into them. When the urge to reach out hits, you sit with it until it passes. When loneliness creeps in, You don't use it as a reason to return to someone who wasn't good for your peace. This is how emotional discipline forms, through the consistent redirection of your attention away from what hurts and toward what heals. Another part of redirecting is taking back control of your narrative. Breakups can create a story in your mind that says you weren't enough, that you failed, that you lost someone irreplaceable. But that story is shaped by the pain of the moment, not the truth of your value. Redirecting means rewriting that narrative consciously. You begin to remind yourself of your strengths, your growth, your capacity to love deeply, and your ability to rise again. You stop seeing the breakup as a reflection of your worth and start seeing it as a chapter that taught you resilience. You stop believing you were abandoned and start realizing you outgrew someone who wasn't prepared for the level of love and consistency you offered. Redirecting means you choose the story that empowers you instead of the story that keeps you wounded. Healing also becomes real when you redirect your emotional energy into building new habits. Pain wants you to stay stuck, but discipline helps you move forward. You begin to structure your days in ways that support your recovery. You surround yourself with positive routines that strengthen your mindset. You give yourself things to look forward to, goals, habits, challenges, and moments that remind you there is life beyond this breakup. Redirecting doesn't erase the pain instantly, but it lessens its power over your life. With each new habit, each moment of self-care, each decision to choose your peace, the hold of the past loosens. Redirecting allows you to create emotional distance from the person you once relied on. That distance is what gives you clarity. The more you redirect, the more you see the situation clearly, not through the lens of emotion, but through the lens of truth. You start recognizing that the love you were giving wasn't being matched. You see the inconsistency you normalized. You see the emotional imbalances you thought were acceptable. And with that clarity, the attachment begins to fade naturally. Redirecting isn't forced indifference. It's authentic detachment born from understanding yourself deeply. Healing by redirecting is also about reclaiming your identity. You stop defining yourself by the role you played in his life and begin defining yourself by who you are becoming. You realize that you are not the version of yourself who begged for attention or settled for breadcrumbs. You're becoming someone new, someone stronger, wiser, more grounded, and more emotionally aware. Redirecting lets you rebuild your identity without the influence of his presence. It teaches you who you are without the person you once made your emotional center. Healing becomes your reality when you finally decide that peace is more important than temporary comfort. That self-respect is more valuable than old memories. That your future deserves more of your energy than your past. Redirecting is the bridge between heartbreak and healing, between attachment and emotional freedom, between who you were and who you are becoming.